In 1918, three empires that had ruled hundreds of millions of people for centuries, some for over 600 years, collapsed within months of each other, not one empire falling, three in the same year, and almost none of it happened the way anyone expected. This episode breaks down how the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires, three of the most powerful political systems on Earth, unraveled almost simultaneously, why one war was enough to destroy what centuries of previous wars couldn't, and how the borders drawn from their wreckage still shape conflicts happening today. At the start of 1914, these three empires controlled a staggering share of the planet. The German Empire was Europe's newest great power, barely 50 years old, but already an industrial and military juggernaut, with the continent's most advanced railway network and a navy built specifically to challenge Britain's. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was one of Europe's oldest continuous states, a patchwork of 11 different nationalities held together under a single crown, ruled by the same Habsburg dynasty that had held power since the 1300s. And the Ottoman Empire had ruled from the Balkans to the Persian Gulf for over 600 years, once the terror of European kings during its height in the 16th century, now widely mocked as the sick man of Europe. Three very different empires at three very different points in their history. Germany was rising, Austria-Hungary was stable but strained. The Ottomans were in slow decline. If you'd asked a diplomat in 1914 which of these three empires was most likely to survive the coming decade, almost none would have picked the weakest-looking one to outlast the strongest. But by 1918, all three would be gone. And the thing that killed them wasn't a single battle. It was a system none of them could survive. Total war, a form of conflict that didn't just test armies, but tested the entire economic, social, and political structure holding each empire together. To understand what total war actually meant for the people living through it, consider a composite example based on wartime letters and records. A German infantryman, conscripted in 1915, who by 1918 had survived 3 years on the Western Front. By his fourth winter of war, his letters home describe something more than exhaustion, a growing disbelief that the war's leadership had any plan beyond simply continuing to fight. His experience wasn't unique. Millions of soldiers across all three empires, German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman alike, spent 1918 fighting a war that increasingly felt unwinnable for governments that seemed unwilling to admit it. That gap between what soldiers were experiencing and what their governments were willing to acknowledge is in many ways the common thread running through all three collapses. Germany entered the war in 1914 as arguably the strongest military power in Europe. But 4 years of fighting on two fronts drained the empire in ways its leaders never planned for. By 1918, Germany's economy was collapsing under a British naval blockade that had cut off food and raw material imports for years. Civilians were surviving on turnip bread. The winter of 1916 to 1917 is still remembered in German history as the Turnip Winter, when the potato harvest failed and turnips, normally livestock feed, became a dietary staple for millions. Industrial workers were striking in major cities. The military itself was exhausted. The massive spring offensive of 1918, Germany's last major gamble to win the war outright, failed to break the Allied lines and cost hundreds of thousands of casualties Germany could no longer replace. Then, in early November 1918, German sailors at the port of Kiel mutinied rather than obey orders for one final, likely suicidal naval offensive. The mutiny spread within days, to other ports, to cities, to Berlin itself. Workers' and soldiers' councils began forming across the country, openly challenging the authority of the Kaiser. On November 9th, with revolution spreading and his own army no longer reliably loyal, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. An empire that had stood for less than 50 years, built on military strength and industrial power, ended not with an invasion of Berlin, but with its own sailors and soldiers refusing to fight any longer. Austria-Hungary's collapse looked nothing like Germany's, where Germany fractured from military and economic exhaustion. Austria-Hungary fractured because it was never really one nation to begin with. The empire held together Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Croats, Serbs, Slovens, Romanians, and Italians, 11 major nationalities, many of whom had wanted independence for generations, and whose languages, parliaments, and local governments the empire had never fully unified, even in peacetime. The strain of total war gave every one of those nationalist movements the opening they'd been waiting for. As the empire's military position deteriorated through 1918, including a decisive defeat at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto against Italy that October, ethnic leaders across the empire stopped asking for autonomy and started simply declaring independence. In October 1918 alone, Czechoslovakia declared independence. The state of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs declared independence. Hungary declared itself separate from Austria. Poland reasserted itself as an independent nation after over a century of partition. It happened so fast that by the time Emperor Karl I formally renounced his role in government in November, there was barely an empire left for him to rule. Historians have noted he wasn't so much overthrown as simply outpaced by events he could no longer control. A 600-year-old ruling dynasty, the Habsburgs, lost their empire not primarily through military defeat, but because the nations trapped inside it simply stopped waiting for permission to leave. The Ottoman collapse had the longest buildup of the three. Long before 1918, the empire had been losing territory for over a century. Nicknamed the Sick Man of Europe, as far back as the 1850s, having already lost most of its European territory in the Balkan Wars, just 2 years before World War I even began. By the time the Ottomans entered the war allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary in 1914, the empire was already a shadow of what it had been at its height. Ottoman forces fought on multiple fronts, against the British in the Middle East, against Russia in the Caucasus, and lost ground steadily throughout the war. By September 1918, British and Arab forces had taken Damascus. The empire's remaining armies were in retreat almost everywhere. On October 30th, 1918, the Ottoman government signed the Armistice of Mudros, effectively ending 6 centuries of Ottoman rule over the Middle East. What remained of the empire would formally dissolve a few years later, replaced by the modern Republic of Turkey. But the outcome was already decided in that single autumn month when one of history's longest-running empires signed away territory it had held for 600 years. Here's what's strange when you look at these three collapses side by side. They happened for almost entirely different reasons. Germany fell from military and economic exhaustion. Austria-Hungary fell from internal fragmentation along ethnic lines. The Ottoman Empire fell from a century of gradual decline. That total war simply finished off. What connected them wasn't a shared cause, it was a shared vulnerability. Each empire had built its legitimacy on strength, military strength, dynastic strength, imperial strength, and total war, a kind of warfare no empire in history had ever had to survive before, stress-tested that legitimacy in every possible direction at once. Whatever the weakest point was, economic, ethnic, or structural, the war found it. The aftermath reshaped the map of Europe and the Middle East almost entirely. New nations emerged from the wreckage: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Turkey, and eventually a patchwork of new states across the former Ottoman Middle East, many with borders drawn by distant diplomats who had never set foot in the regions they were dividing. Some of those borders still define political conflicts happening today, over a century later. 3 empires, 1 year, and a map of the modern world that, in many ways, we're still living inside. It's a pattern worth remembering any time a system looks unshakable, whether it's a government, an institution, or an economy. Strength built on one kind of pressure doesn't automatically hold up against a completely different kind of pressure. 1918 is a reminder that the thing that finally breaks a powerful system is rarely the thing anyone was watching for. It's tempting to think of empires as permanent, too big, too old, too powerful to simply disappear. But 1918 is proof that even the oldest, most entrenched systems can unravel in months once the right pressure finds their weakest point. Next episode, we're going back to one of the empires we covered today to ask what might have happened if it had survived. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and step into the vault.